He was promised freedom, not for loyalty, not for labor, but for what his body could give. 40 women, 40 lives. Then he was told the chains would fall. The man's name was Solomon. They called him the strongest on the land. But strength meant nothing when the man who owned him learned how to use it against him. Each woman came with a different story. One tempted, one threatened, one fooled by kindness. And by the time Solomon understood what he was part of, it was too late to stop. The fields went quiet. The laughter disappeared, and the sound that replaced it was counting. This is not the story of a slave who obeyed. It's the story of how a promise became a curse, and how 40 lives were taken to prove one man's idea of power. Tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Then stay with us. Because when you hear what happened at Ebon Hill in 1841, you'll understand that some chains are built inside the mind. Ebon Hill, Kentucky, 1841. The plantation was quiet in the hours before dawn, when the line between command and faith was easiest to blur. That was when Malachi Ward preferred to speak. His words were never shouted. They were measured, careful, carrying the weight of purpose rather than cruelty. He spoke like a man convinced that what he asked was sacred. He called Solomon from the quarters one morning and spoke of a vision, a new beginning for their people. He said that strength must not die in chains, that their kind had been broken too long by other men's bloodlines. But now he claimed they could rebuild from their own. He looked at Solomon with something like admiration, telling him he had been chosen to carry that burden. Malachi's reasoning was simple, persuasive, and poisonous. He said that a man strong enough to sow 40 lives would earn his freedom. He said every birth would be a brick in a foundation that would outlast the field, the fences, even death itself. He said Solomon's name would live in the children who bore his blood. It was the kind of promise that didn't sound like sin when spoken slowly enough. Solomon listened in silence, his face calm, his mind still loyal. For years he had known only one truth: obey and survive. The promise of freedom was a language he had never dared to speak aloud. Now it stood before him, wrapped in the soft tone of a man who seemed to offer destiny instead of orders. Malachi placed a hand on his shoulder, spoke of heritage, of restoring the strength stripped from them by generations of cruelty. He said the world would never give them freedom. They would have to build it themselves, one child at a time. The words carried fire. They sounded righteous. They sounded like history being rewritten. But under every word was control. Malachi's eyes stayed fixed on Solomon's silence. He studied it the way one studies a tool before use. He was not promising deliverance. He was securing obedience that would last longer than pain ever could. When Solomon finally nodded, Malachi smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had made a covenant with God. He spoke of women already chosen. Good women, he said, deserving of strong sons. He told Solomon it was not lust but duty, not command but calling. Each life born would bring him closer to freedom. And for a moment Solomon believed it. He believed that he could use what had always been used against him, his strength, to earn something no one had ever given him: choice. That night, Malachi wrote nothing, signed nothing. The papers promising freedom were already prepared, locked in a chest beneath his desk, sealed with his own key. They were proof not of mercy but of ownership. When Solomon returned to the fields the next morning, he worked with the same steadiness as always. The sun rose over Ebon Hill like it did every day, indifferent, unchanged. Yet something in him shifted. The order had been given, the promise spoken, and the trap quietly closed. Malachi watched from his porch, calm as ever, hands folded behind his back. He did not see a man. He saw a harvest waiting to be sown, and somewhere in the distance, before the first woman was even chosen, the wind passed through the cane fields with a sound that could have been whispering or warning. The bargain had been made, and freedom for the first time began to look like another kind of cage. The first woman's name was Lydia. She was quiet, steady in her work, and trusted by nearly everyone on the plantation. When Malachi chose her, no one questioned it. He spoke of reward and renewal, of her role in something greater. Lydia didn't speak much afterward. She moved through the days like someone walking towards something she couldn't quite see. Weeks passed in strange calm. Malachi spoke of the first success as if it were scripture. He treated Solomon with measured warmth, never praise, just acknowledgement, as if obedience were finally taking the shape he'd intended. For a short while, the plantation felt unnaturally peaceful, too precise, too clean. Then one morning, Lydia was gone. The quarters she slept in were swept spotless, the bedding washed and folded. No cup, no scrap of fabric, not even the comb she always kept near the basin remained. It was as though she'd never lived there at all. The stillness of the place unsettled Solomon. It wasn't mourning that filled the air, but design, like someone had erased her carefully, piece by piece, and then polished what remained. When Solomon asked, Malachi answered softly as though explaining a mercy. Lydia had been freed, he said, sent north with help from a sympathetic trader. Her child would be raised in a place without chains. It was a blessing, not a disappearance. The story was told too smoothly to be questioned aloud, yet something in Malachi's eyes betrayed him. There was no joy in the words, no satisfaction, only distance, the kind of silence that comes from a man who's already moved on to the next part of a plan. That night, Solomon searched the edge of the property under the pale half-moon. He found nothing. No footprints, no discarded bundle, not even the sound of breath beyond the fields. But the next morning, smoke drifted from the pit behind the main house. Malachi was burning something, and Solomon came close. He saw fabric, pieces of it, pale and torn, turning black in the fire. It was the kind Lydia used for her apron. Malachi didn't turn around. He said only that it was good to let the past go clean. The words landed heavy in Solomon's mind. They sounded like faith, but felt like command. He wanted to believe Lydia was safe, that this was how freedom began. Quietly, privately, with no farewell. But each time he turned the thought over, it seemed thinner, like something built to hide the truth rather than reveal it. The plantation moved on as if nothing had happened. The women still worked. The field still sang under the blades. Yet the rhythm was off, as though one note had been cut from the melody, and the song continued, pretending not to notice. Days later, Solomon realized something subtle but irreversible. No one spoke Lydia's name anymore. Not the others. Not even the older women who had known her since childhood. Her absence wasn't discussed. It was practiced. They had been taught wordlessly how to forget. That night he looked toward Malachi's house and saw the faint glow of lamplight through the upper window. He thought of the locked chest where the papers waited, the promise of freedom sealed inside something that didn't open. He wondered for the first time if freedom was what Lydia had been given or what had been taken. And in that silence, the first crack appeared in his faith. It wasn't loud. It didn't break him, but it was enough. Enough to let the doubt in, small and quiet, the kind that spreads on its own once it begins. There was no announcement when the counting began. One morning Solomon found Malachi in the storehouse, standing before a length of timber newly fastened to the wall. A small box of iron nails rested beside him. The wood had been sanded smooth, pale, and unmarked, waiting to hold something permanent. Malachi said it was to keep order, to measure progress, to ensure the promise stayed clear. For every new life conceived, a nail would be driven into the beam. He called it a record of hope, but the sound it made was too final, too heavy to belong to hope. Each strike rang through the storehouse like a burial. The first nail went in that morning. Malachi struck it twice, slow and deliberate, before pausing to look at Solomon. "One," he said softly, as if counting out a prayer. Then he left the hammer beside the beam and walked away. After that, Solomon began noticing how each day on Eben Hill was being divided by sound. The low rhythm of labor, the distant rustle of cane, and on rare mornings, the sharp report of metal into wood. It was always only one nail, never two, never rushed. Weeks later, the beam held 7 of them. Each head gleamed where the hammer had flattened it, perfectly aligned in a row. Malachi inspected it every evening with quiet satisfaction, as if he were tending a field of iron. He never explained who decided when another nail should be added, or how he kept count. Solomon tried not to think about it, until one day he passed the storehouse before dawn, and saw the beam again. 8 nails, he froze. The night before there had been 7. No woman had been chosen, no new birth announced. Yet the beam had grown on its own. He ran his thumb along the cold metal heads, feeling the pattern. 7 driven deep, 1 newer, still rough at the edge. The hammer lay where Malachi had left it, untouched. The air was still. When Malachi appeared behind him, Solomon stepped back quickly. The older man's expression didn't change. He looked at the beam and smiled faintly. "The work moves faster than we think," he said. "That's how you know it's blessed." It was not said as comfort. It was said like fact. From that day forward, Solomon began to watch the beam more than the fields. He couldn't say why, but he felt drawn to it, the line of nails shining faintly in the dim light, each one proof that something irreversible had taken place. He didn't need to know which woman it marked. The silence that followed each addition told him enough. Over time, he began to sense that the project no longer belonged to either of them. The nails seemed to appear even when Malachi wasn't present. Sometimes at night, Solomon swore he could hear faint tapping from the storehouse, the hollow rhythm of work being done by unseen hands. The plantation carried on with its strange order, days of labor, nights of absence. The women avoided eye contact. Their silence deepened. When one of them vanished, the sound of hammering followed within days. The count kept pace with loss, not creation. One evening, Solomon walked to the beam again and stood before it in the fading light. There were 9 nails now. He reached out and touched the newest one, its surface warm, as if struck only moments earlier. He waited, listening. Nothing moved. Then he understood. The beam was not marking the women alone. It was marking him too, the man whose strength fed the pattern, whose obedience made it possible. Each nail was another piece of his body surrendered, another measure of himself driven into the wood. And still, the count continued. The women began to arrive without warning. One came by wagon, another on foot. A third was brought at night in the back of a cart covered by cloth. None of them seemed to know why the others were there. Each carried a different story in her eyes, a story someone else had written for her. Malachy received them one by one, his voice changing with every introduction. To one, he spoke like a preacher, promising that she had been chosen by Providence to restore the blood of her people. To another, he used a softer tone, the language of safety, saying that Ebon Hill was a refuge from men who sought to harm her. A third was promised money, land, and a new life if she remained obedient for a single season. No 2 lies were the same, yet each one carried the same center, the command to stay, to serve, to bear. Within a week, 5 women slept in the east wing of the house. By the second week, there were 9. Solomon noticed how none of them spoke to each other at length. When they did, their stories collided. 2 claimed to be the first. Another believed she was the only. Each swore Malachy had told her something sacred, something not to be shared. It became clear to Solomon that silence was no longer fear. It was confusion turned inward. The contradictions spread like infection. One woman prayed before meals, repeating words Malachy had taught her. Fragments of scripture turned into commands. Another worked the fields, believing she would earn wages to send north. And one, the youngest, waited each night for Malachy to call her by the name of a woman who'd vanished weeks earlier. The plantation began to change shape without anyone moving a wall. The rhythm that once defined it, labor, rest, order, twisted into something weightless, uncertain. People drifted between purpose and disbelief. Every truth Malachy told had an equal and opposite lie. Solomon watched this from a distance he couldn't measure. His role was shifting from participant to observer, though he still followed orders. Each new arrival brought a sharper edge to his unease. The stories didn't align, and yet the house remained in perfect calm, as if built to survive contradictions. When Solomon confronted Malachy about the confusion, the answer was simple and cruel. Each must believe in what keeps her still, he said. That night, Solomon walked the edge of the property where the cane met the forest. He tried to recall how many women had arrived and how many had left, but the numbers blurred. The hammering in the storehouse had resumed. It no longer sounded like progress. It sounded like a reminder. The next morning, 2 more women appeared. One said she had come for work. The other said she had been sent by God. Both called Malachy by a name Solomon had never heard before: Father. The web had widened. In the following days, Solomon began to see the pattern, the perfect alignment between faith, fear, and affection. Malachy had turned each emotion into a chain, invisible but strong, and every attempt Solomon made to reason with himself, to believe this was still a path toward freedom, dissolved the moment another woman arrived. By the time the 10th woman was brought into the house, Solomon knew the truth he would never speak aloud. There was no order, no plan, no liberation waiting at the end. There was only possession, multiplied, refined, and perfected. And beneath the surface calm of Ebon Hill, the lies had begun to grow roots. There came a night when Solomon could no longer move his body as commanded. It was not rebellion born from rage, but a quiet exhaustion that reached something deeper than fatigue. For months, he had obeyed without understanding, trusting that each act, each promise, each nail driven into the beam, carried him closer to freedom. But the lies had multiplied until no word spoken on Ebon Hill meant what it once did. When Malachy called him that night, Solomon did not go. He stood at the edge of the fields, hands still, watching the faint glow of the master's window. He waited for anger to come, but only silence arrived. It was the first decision that belonged entirely to him. By dawn, Malachy's patience had vanished. He summoned Solomon to the yard and spoke calmly, almost gently, about the danger of hesitation. He said it poisoned the spirit, that one man's reluctance could bring ruin to 40 lives. Solomon listened without answering. The words were measured like scripture, each one landing with the precision of a nail. Then Malachy gave his command again: to obey, to continue, to serve. Solomon lowered his eyes and said no. The word did not echo. It fell flat, small, but it changed everything. Malachi's face did not twist or darken. He simply nodded once and turned away. A few moments later, two men dragged one of the women from the quarters. The youngest, barely grown. Her name was Ruth. She had done nothing, said nothing. But Malachi needed the lesson to be remembered. He spoke quietly as she was held in front of Solomon. "When the body refuses," he said, "the punishment must fall elsewhere." The sound that followed was brief. A single cry cut short by a strike across the face. Blood darkened the dirt at her feet. Solomon did not move. He wanted to. Every muscle in his body screamed for it, but he stood still, chained not by rope but by understanding. It was not his pain that Malachi sought. It was his obedience fed by guilt. When the beating stopped, Ruth was carried away without a word. Malachi looked at Solomon and said, "Do you see now what your silence buys?" Then he left him standing in the yard alone. That night, the plantation was quieter than it had ever been. Even the insects seemed to have learned the lesson. Solomon sat beneath the window where the beam of nails hung and counted them again. Each one a memory, each one a weight. He wondered if another nail would be added for Ruth, though she had conceived nothing. When he finally went to Malachi's door, it was not submission that guided him, but dread. He did not knock. He entered, knelt, and said only, "Tell me what must be done." Malachi smiled faintly, as though the order of the world had righted itself. He spoke of duty, of strength as the gift that held everything together. But Solomon heard only one truth. His strength no longer belonged to him. It had been taken, repurposed, and turned into a weapon used against the innocent. As he walked back toward the fields, the air around him felt heavier, slower, almost alive with accusation. He had refused once and someone else had paid the price. The lesson was clear, absolute, and unspoken. From that night forward, every act of obedience would come from the same place as his defiance, guilt. And in that guilt the curse began to take form. The first child was born on a night without sound. The air over Ebon Hill was heavy, unmoving, as if the world itself refused to bear witness. Malachi insisted the birth take place inside the main house under his supervision. He said it was fitting. The first life of a new generation should begin beneath the roof of its maker. The woman's labor lasted through the night. Solomon waited outside the door, listening to the muffled rhythm of breath, the scrape of a chair, Malachi's steady voice repeating quiet instructions. Then, just before dawn, a thin cry cut through the stillness, brief, almost fragile. It lasted only a few seconds before silence fell again. When the door opened, Malachi stepped out holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. His hands were steady, his expression unreadable. He told Solomon the child had not survived. "Weak blood," he said. "The body must learn how to hold the spirit before it can last." His voice was calm, detached, the way a man might describe a crop that failed to take root. Solomon looked past him into the room. The mother lay still, her eyes closed, sweat drying on her skin. The sheets beneath her were stained dark. She whispered the word "alive" once before turning her face away. Later, when Malachi left the room, Solomon entered quietly. The bundle lay near the basin. He unwrapped it slowly, his hands shaking, though he didn't understand why. The child's skin was pale, lips faintly blue. Around the tiny neck a faint dark ring, not a mark of illness but of pressure. The bruises were small, perfectly circular, left by fingers. He stood there for a long time, the truth unfolding without words. The child had not been born weak. It had been silenced. Outside, the sound of hammering began again. 2 strikes, deliberate and slow. Another nail into the beam. Another number added to the count. Even the dead, it seemed, were worthy of record. When Solomon returned to the fields, the morning light felt sharper, wrong. The people worked without speaking. The women kept their eyes on the ground, their movements careful, mechanical. Every one of them must have known. They did not ask where the child had gone. They knew what it meant when the crying stopped so soon. Malachi addressed them that evening. He spoke of purity, of strength being tested by loss. "The soil rejects what is not ready," he said, "but it will learn to accept the right seed." His words came soft and even, like a sermon. Solomon noticed the others listening in stillness, as if afraid to breathe. That night, Solomon lay awake and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Every sound on the plantation, a door closing, a shovel scraping earth, the distant hammer striking iron, echoed through him like accusation. The lie that had once looked like purpose was gone. What remained was something colder, a system without mercy. He tried to tell himself the child's death was an exception, but the image of the bruises would not leave him. He saw them every time he closed his eyes. The line between his labor and Malachi's cruelty vanished. By the next morning, the beam held another nail. The count continued. Solomon said nothing. He worked as he always had. But inside something broke, a silent fracture that would never heal. He was no longer a believer. He was a participant. And the difference between the two felt smaller than air. After the first death, something changed in Malachi's manner. He no longer spoke of freedom or purpose. He no longer spoke much at all. Instead, he began to schedule nights not as ceremony, but as labor. The pauses between them shortened until they vanished entirely. The act that was once presented as sacred became mechanical. Malachi no longer introduced the women. He merely gestured and Solomon obeyed. No words, no pretense of reason. The air in the quarters was heavy with silence, and the silence began to feel like part of the command. At first, Solomon tried to remember their names. He whispered them in his mind to keep from forgetting they were human. Lydia, Ruth, Anna. He repeated them like prayers. But after weeks of endless motion, dawns bleeding into nights, bodies passing through routine like clockwork, the names began to fade, the faces blurred. What remained were numbers. Malachi started using them openly. 2nd, he would say. 10th, 14th. He spoke as if counting inventory. Each woman reduced to a place in a sequence, a mark on the beam. The sound of the hammer came more often now, irregular and fast, not tied to births or time, but to the rhythm of Malachi's obsession. Solomon worked through it all. His body moved when commanded, detached from the mind that once questioned. Thought had become a luxury. He no longer asked who or why or when. He began to exist only between tasks, sleeping without dreams, waking without reason. Even hunger lost its shape. He realized he could no longer count the days. The seasons felt wrong. Rain came and went but carried no memory of when it last fell. Sometimes the women were replaced overnight. Sometimes they vanished mid-season. Malachi never mentioned them again. Each morning Solomon's body ached with a kind of pain that had nothing to do with flesh. He caught himself looking at his hands, wondering if they still belonged to him. They were instruments now, steady, reliable, useful. And that usefulness, he understood, was the only thing that kept him alive. The plantation had fallen into a rhythm too precise to be human. Work began at the same moment the sun touched the cane, stopped when the last nail shadow reached the dirt. Malachi no longer prayed aloud. His sermons had been replaced by instructions, clear, monotone, and endless. One night, Solomon tried to remember how long it had been since the first woman vanished. He couldn't. The memory felt distant, as if belonging to someone else. The faces of the living and the dead merged into one continuous shape, moving through time like the hands of a clock with no numbers. When he passed the beam in the storehouse again, he counted 28 nails. He remembered seeing 14 only days before, or what he thought were days. The beam's pattern had doubled without warning, each head gleaming like an eye. That was when he understood. The count was not following them. They were following it. The system had begun to feed on itself, growing regardless of their actions. It no longer waited for conception or birth. It created its own momentum. Solomon stood before the beam until his vision blurred, unable to tell whether the wood was swelling or breathing. Then in the distance the hammer struck again, though no one was holding it. He turned away. His body moved automatically toward the next task, the next command. The sound followed him, a hollow pulse that neither stopped nor began, and in that repetition, Solomon lost the measure of himself. Days and nights folded together, indistinguishable. Time became another tool of the plantation, one more thing he no longer owned. It began without warning, not as a plan but as an absence. The sound of voices simply stopped. At first it was small things, a woman who no longer answered when spoken to, a prayer left unfinished, work done without words. Malachi noticed but said nothing. He assumed it was grief or exhaustion. But within days, the silence spread through the quarters like a fever. No one spoke during meals. No one asked for water or song or mercy. They obeyed his orders but gave nothing back. The plantation had always been quiet, but this was different. It was not the stillness of fear. It was deliberate, controlled, a quiet that felt chosen. Malachi's patience frayed as his commands met air. He began to shout, though shouting had never been his way. He ordered them to speak, to pray, to answer. None did. When he struck one of them, she made no sound at all. The lack of reaction unsettled him more than screams ever could. He tried breaking the rhythm. He changed the hours, withheld food, summoned them to the house at strange times. Still no sound. The work continued. The tasks were completed, but Ebon Hill had become a world of gestures and glances, where every silence felt like a verdict. Even Solomon, who once moved like part of the machinery, began to feel something shift. He saw the women look at him without words, not pleading, not condemning, only knowing. Their stillness held a kind of power he couldn't name. They were no longer instruments in Malachi's design. They had become something else, witnesses bound together by refusal. The breaking point came at dusk. Malachi gathered them near the storehouse, his temper buried under a calm voice that trembled at its edges. He demanded one of them speak. Just one word to prove obedience remained. No one answered. The youngest stepped forward instead. Her eyes met his without hesitation. She lifted her chin, took a shard of glass from her sleeve, and drew it across her throat before anyone could move. The act was swift, the sound almost non-existent. She fell in silence, her blood striking the dirt beside the beam. For the first time in months, the hammer did not follow. Malachi froze, the calm draining from him. Solomon rushed forward, but she was already gone. The blood reached the base of the beam, seeping across the lowest nail, marking it like a signature. The air held not grief, not shock, but something colder. The women did not cry out or flee. They simply stood watching. The silence remained unbroken. Malachi stepped back, staring at the stain, his mind twisting to preserve itself. "A sacrifice," he whispered. "The first willing one, the blood that sanctifies the work." He repeated it until it became litany. The women stared through him, as if they were watching a man dissolve. Solomon couldn't look away from the body. For the first time, he understood the shape of resistance, that it did not require strength or noise. It required only the decision to no longer belong. The woman's death was not surrender. It was theft. She had taken herself back in the only way left to her. That night, the plantation was absolute in its quiet. The hammer never struck. The count froze at 29. Malachi sat alone near the beam, staring at the dried line of blood, whispering to himself about purity, order, and destiny. He believed the silence meant worship. He never understood it meant war. By the following spring, the births came in clusters, one after another without pause. Malachi called it the harvest of strength, as though the children were crops rather than blood. But there was something strange about them, even at first glance. When Solomon saw the first newborn of the season, he felt an unease that he couldn't name. The child's skin was lighter, the eyes sharper, the shape of the face unfamiliar. It was not his. He told himself it was chance, that life borrowed from many shades. But when the second came and then the third, the resemblance could no longer be ignored. Each child bore the same distinct traits: a small fold beneath the eyes, a scar-like crease at the corner of the mouth, and the same narrow nose that belonged only to one man on Ebon Hill, Malachi Ward. Solomon began noticing how the timing of births matched the nights Malachi vanished from his own quarters. He claimed to be traveling to settlements, arranging new arrivals, spreading the vision of their people's rebirth. But his horse tracks always led back to the east wing where the women slept. Solomon's unease turned to nausea the night he saw the lantern light flicker in that direction long after curfew. He waited in the shadows near the cane, heart pounding but steps silent. Hours passed, then the light disappeared, and Malachi emerged, moving with the calm of a man unburdened by sin. That was when Solomon understood that his own role had never been creation, only concealment. The children called his name because they were told to, but their faces betrayed the truth. Their eyes mirrored the man who had ordered their conception. Each one was a replica, refined through repetition, closer to Malachi than to any living woman or man. When Solomon looked at them, he no longer saw innocence. He saw copies, manufactured lineage shaped in secrecy. He had not been chosen for saint. He had been used for distraction. His body was the veil that hid Malachi's corruption. The realization struck with a weight that hollowed him. He thought of the promise that had begun it all. 40 lives for freedom. He saw it now for what it truly was, an act of vanity disguised as liberation. Malachi's dream was not to rebuild a people, but to multiply himself, to fill the land with his own reflection. The next morning, Solomon stood outside the main house while Malachi inspected the children gathered near the porch. The man's eyes glimmered with pride. He touched each forehead as if blessing his own image, counting them softly under his breath. It was the same calm rhythm he once used for nails. When their gazes met, Malachi smiled. "Look at what your labor has done," he said. "They carry your strength." Solomon said nothing. He only stared, first at the children, then at the man who believed himself a god. Inside, disgust and shame coiled together until he could no longer separate one from the other. Every act of obedience he had performed now felt like collaboration. He had protected a monster, built the very altar of his own humiliation. That night, he dreamed of the infants again. Dozens of them, identical faces crowding around him, whispering in Malachi's voice. When he woke, he could still hear the echo. The next time Malachi spoke of destiny, Solomon didn't listen. He already knew what drove the man. Not faith, not order, not freedom. It was self-creation, a hunger to become his own beginning and his own end. And in that revelation, Solomon saw the shape of the final sin. Not murder, not lust, but the belief that one man's blood was holy enough to replace everyone else's. By the end of the year, Ebon Hill had fallen silent. The fields lay untouched, the air thick with rot from untended cane. The quarters that once held laughter, prayer, or weeping now stood empty. Doors open, beds stripped, walls clean as if scoured of memory. Only one woman remained. Her name was never spoken aloud. She was heavy with child, the 39th. Malachi called her the last key. He moved through the house like a priest in mourning, whispering to himself, counting on his fingers, tracing symbols into the dust on the floor. The vision that had begun with the promise of life now circled death. He spoke of it openly, calmly, that the cycle could not close until its maker was buried inside it. He told Solomon his work was done. He said, "The strength that built the foundation must also seal it." The words carried no rage, only certainty. Malachi had reached the part of his madness where everything sounded like prophecy. Solomon, standing before him, realized that the end had been written long before the first woman arrived. He was never meant to walk away free. Malachi began speaking of the final seed, a phrase Solomon had heard only once before, in one of the master's sermons after the first death. Back then he thought it meant completion. Now he understood it meant sacrifice. Each day that followed felt rehearsed. Malachi stopped visiting the fields, stopped eating with the others. He spent his hours preparing the house, burning documents, cleaning the floors, polishing the beam that still held its long line of nails. He would pause before it often, his hand hovering near the end, as though deciding where the last one would go. The woman in the east wing rarely left her room. Solomon brought her water, food, wood for the fire. She never spoke, but when she looked at him, there was no fear, only exhaustion, as if she had seen the end of the story before anyone else. At night, Malachi's footsteps echoed across the hallways long after the lamps were out. Sometimes Solomon heard him humming softly, the same melody he used to sing before a birth. It wasn't joy. It was ritual. The plantation had become a mausoleum waiting to be filled. Solomon knew now that if he stayed still, he would die when Malachi chose it. Maybe by hand, maybe by faith, maybe as part of some twisted idea of closure. He also knew that if he ran, there was nowhere to go. The towns beyond Ebon Hill would not take him. His name, his face, his silence all belonged here. But something inside him shifted. Not hope, not courage, but clarity. Freedom would not come from mercy. It would come from the removal of the man who defined it. When Malachi spoke of their final day, Solomon didn't answer. He only watched him carefully, measuring the tremor in his hands, the cracks in his calm. Madness had replaced strength. It made him vulnerable. In that weakness, Solomon saw a chance. He began waiting for moments when Malachi's attention drifted, when he stared too long at the beam, when his voice faltered mid-prayer. He studied the rhythm of his movements the way one studies a storm before it breaks. The last woman's breathing grew heavier as the weeks closed in. Every sound from her room reminded Solomon of what still bound him, life and death under another man's command. By the time the 39th nail was hammered into place, Solomon had made his decision. If this was to be the final act, he would decide how it ended. That night, for the first time in years, he didn't move at another man's command. He moved for his own. By the final month, the house had gone completely still. The air inside Ebon Hill was heavy with the scent of candle wax and damp wood. The last woman labored behind the east wing's locked door. Malachi no longer prayed or preached. He waited. Solomon could no longer endure the waiting. He had carried guilt in silence for too long. Guilt for the vanished, for the dead, for the women who still moved through the house like shadows. The moment had come when obedience no longer served survival. It only fed the thing that had devoured them all. He found Malachi in the parlor that night, sitting before the beam, the line of nails gleaming in the lamplight. The old man was whispering, counting under his breath, his fingers twitching as if still hammering what was already finished. Solomon stepped forward. "Tell me what this is," he said. His voice was calm, but the calm came from exhaustion, not fear. Malachi didn't look up. "This," he said softly, "is perfection." He rose slowly, eyes glazed with the kind of certainty that no reasoning could touch. "You think I did this to build you a future? You misunderstand. I built this to build myself. The blood that made me free was never pure. It was split. White and black, master and slave, sin fighting virtue in the same vein. I only wanted to make it whole again." Solomon stood still, feeling the words strike him like slow blows. Malachi walked closer, his voice low and fevered. "Every woman who bore my seed was born from my seed. Their mothers were mine and their mothers before them. The line folds inward now, pure, cleansed, perfected. You were only a veil, strength to disguise my work until it was finished." Solomon said nothing. The horror came not in a wave but as a suffocating quiet. Every disappearance, every birth, every nail fell into place. The ledger of lies now spelled one truth. Malachi Ward had bred himself into his own daughters. The 40 births were not meant to expand their people, but to erase everyone else from the line. Malachi's eyes burned with triumph. "They will all carry my blood," he said, voice shaking with joy. "There will be no trace of the world that broke me. Every sin will return to me. Every child will bear my face. I will end as I began, self-made." Solomon's hands trembled, though not from fear. He looked around the parlor at the nails, the beam, the ghostly order of a house built on madness. The revelation didn't shatter him. It clarified him. All the years he had obeyed, all the guilt he had carried, had been for this, the creation of a single man's sickness. He thought of the dead women, the silenced children, the empty quarters. There was no salvation left to seek, no bargain left to keep. Malachi stepped closer, placing a hand on Solomon's shoulder as he had on that first day. "You've done your part," he said. "You can rest now. The final life will complete the circle. The Father will be the Son, and the Son the Father." Solomon's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. For the first time, Malachi looked uncertain. The calm in Solomon's face was not obedience, it was judgment. That night, as the rain began to fall over Eben Hill, Solomon understood the truth that had been waiting since the first nail. This would not end in prophecy or purity, it would end in blood. And for the first time it would be Malachi's. The storm came without warning. Thunder rolled over Eben Hill like a drumbeat from something ancient, shaking the air until every sound in the house felt hollow. The final woman's labor had begun, her cries muffled behind the locked door of the east wing. Malachi waited in the parlor, sitting beneath the beam of nails, his hands folded neatly across his lap. He looked calm, too calm, like a man waiting for a ceremony to end rather than for a life to begin. Solomon stood near the doorway, soaked in rain, the faint light of the lamp carving hard shadows across his face. Neither man spoke. The silence between them was heavier than the thunder. When Malachi finally rose, he didn't turn toward the east wing. He turned toward Solomon. "It's time," he said. "You've carried the burden long enough. You'll rest tonight, and I will complete the work." His voice was soft, but there was finality in it, the kind reserved for death sentences and prayers. Solomon didn't answer. He stepped closer, his breath steady, eyes fixed on the old man's face. The sound of thunder broke again, closer this time. Malachi reached for the hammer resting near the beam, as if to add one last nail, but Solomon caught his wrist. The motion was quiet, without anger, deliberate, certain. For a moment they struggled, the sound of skin against skin blending with the distant wail of the woman giving birth. Then the fight ended almost before it began. A sharp movement, a shift of balance, and the hammer struck the floor. Malachi gasped, his body folding under Solomon's strength. There was no spectacle in it, no shouts or curses, only the raw inevitability of a man who had built his own end. Solomon's hands tightened around his throat. Malachi clawed weakly, eyes wide, the look of disbelief that power could finally turn against him. Behind them, the sound of labor grew louder, one life arriving as another was taken. When Malachi's body went still, the thunder stopped. The air itself seemed to hesitate. Solomon let him fall gently to the floor. The beam loomed above, its final nail unused. For a moment, the house held its breath. Then from the east wing, the silence deepened. The crying had stopped. Solomon walked toward the door and pushed it open. The woman lay motionless, her body spent, the child in her arms unmoving. Its skin was pale, its mouth open but soundless. He understood immediately. The cycle had completed itself. Creation and destruction had met in the same instant. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling, not from fear but from the weight of everything he had carried. The experiment was finished. The promise, the lies, the prayers, all of it ended in the same room, beneath the same roof. He rose slowly and returned to the parlor. Malachi's body lay beneath the beam, eyes open toward the ceiling, mouth still twisted in the faint echo of a smile. Outside, the rain began again, soft, relentless, cleansing nothing. Solomon stood over him, breathing hard, unable to tell if what he felt was victory or ruin. The freedom he had once dreamed of no longer had a shape. It was only absence, the removal of a man who had decided what life and death should mean. The plantation was silent now. No footsteps, no orders, no cries, only the hum of the storm settling back into the soil. Solomon looked around the empty house, every corner alive with stillness. For the first time in years there was no sound of counting, and yet the silence did not feel like peace. It felt like the pause before something remembered its name. The storm ended by morning. The house smelled of ash and iron, and every door stood open. Nothing on Eben Hill moved except Solomon. He began to dig before the sun had fully risen. There were no prayers, no witnesses. He didn't know if the act was mercy or punishment, only that it had to be done. The ground behind the main house was soft from rain, the soil dark and pliant. He chose it for no reason other than its silence. He started with the woman from the east wing, then the child, then Malachi. The others followed, the ones left in the house, the fields, the quarters. He dug until his hands bled and his vision blurred. The rhythm of the shovel replaced thought. Each grave was the same width, the same depth, placed with a precision that felt more like compulsion than care. By nightfall, the rows stretched across the clearing. When he stepped back, they looked orderly, almost deliberate. 40 graves in all, one for every life Malachi had claimed to create, and one for himself, though he was not yet ready to fill it. He stood there for a long time, unable to look away. The count mattered. The number had ruled everything. Now it was his only anchor, 40. No more, no less. But when dawn returned and he came back to the clearing, there were 41. He froze. The new mound sat at the far edge of the line, indistinguishable from the rest, except for a faint depression where the soil had settled. It was the right shape, the right size, placed exactly where another should not be. He counted again, then again, always 41. He searched for evidence of his own mistake, an error in memory, exhaustion, confusion. But the spade marks on the new mound were not his. The soil had been turned differently, cleaner, as though pressed into place by smaller hands. No footprints surrounded it. No tools were missing. No animals had disturbed the others. It was simply there, as if the land itself had finished the task for him. Solomon stood over it, breathing hard, the shovel shaking in his grip. He thought of the missing women, the vanished nights. The way Malachi's count had always exceeded reason. Perhaps one of them had escaped. Perhaps she had returned in secret, burying something the rest of them were never meant to see. Or perhaps it was nothing human at all, the earth reclaiming its due, closing the circle he had tried to break. He crouched beside the mound and pressed his palm against the soil. It was warm, not from the sun but from within. A slow pulse rose through his hand, faint but steady, like a heartbeat deep in the ground. He pulled away, stumbling back. The air seemed to thicken. The trees bent slightly inward, their branches shivering without wind. For the first time since the murders, Solomon felt fear that was not of man, but of consequence. 40 lives had been taken, and now the land demanded one more. Whether the extra grave was gift or warning, he couldn't tell. It stood as proof that what he had buried was not finished. As dusk fell, he covered the graves with stones to keep the earth from shifting. Still, the ground beneath him seemed to breathe, slow and patient.
He tried to walk away, but the pulse followed him through the soil, through the roots, through the memory of every strike of the hammer. The circle was closed, but it had not stopped moving. The rain returned before dawn, a slow, steady fall that thickened until it drowned the horizon. The sky hung low and colorless. Water streamed from the porch roof and collected in the field trenches, turning soil to liquid. By midday, the graves began to bleed mud. Solomon stood in the clearing, the rain soaking through his clothes, blurring the neat rows he had built with his hands. The markers he'd set, stones and sticks, shifted and disappeared one by one, drawn downward into the rising water. The earth no longer held still. He tried to shore one grave with the shovel, but the soil gave way beneath him. The ground sank with a long guttural sound, as if breathing in. Beneath the collapse came something worse. Faint rhythmic noises that didn't belong to thunder or wind. They were cries not loud enough to be human, not close enough to be certain. They came in short, wet bursts from below, muffled by mud. Some sounded like weeping, others like gasps between laughter. Solomon froze. The sound pulsed with the rain, growing clearer with every drop that struck the ground. Then the first grave collapsed completely. The water rushed in, filling the hollow. Bubbles surfaced, large, slow, deliberate, as if the earth itself were exhaling something it had held too long. Solomon backed away, heart pounding, his boots sinking ankle-deep. The graves were merging, the lines between them dissolving, the soil turning to dark slurry. The count, 41, vanished into formlessness. The storm thickened. Lightning illuminated the house in stuttering flashes, each one showing more of its decay, the roof sagging, windows gaping, walls bowing inward. Water ran down the parlor walls, carrying streaks of soot and blood. Inside, the beam of nails trembled with each thunderclap, vibrating like a stringed instrument out of tune. When the first section of the roof collapsed, it didn't fall. It folded, as though pulled from below. Solomon turned and ran. The ground followed him, shifting underfoot, mud clutching at his legs with suction strong enough to slow his steps. He heard the house groan, the foundation splitting, the beam of nails snapping in two. Each break echoed like the toll of a bell. Behind him the graves convulsed. The cries grew louder, no longer faint, but rising in waves, mingling with the roar of the storm. They were not cries of pain. They were sharper, higher, the sound of something new being forced into the world. Birth, not death. He reached the edge of the field and looked back once. The house was sinking, half swallowed by the earth. The last thing he saw before lightning blinded him was the outline of the parlor window, the faint shape of Malachi's body still sitting upright where he had been buried, as if watching the house consume itself. The rain blurred everything into motion. Water and soil moved as one, pulling the plantation down into the pit that had once been its heart. Solomon ran into the trees, branches slapping against his face, his lungs burning. The cries behind him faded, replaced by the low, endless hum of the storm. When he finally stopped, miles from the house, he could still feel the ground vibrating beneath his feet, faint, constant, alive. The sound was not following him, but it was inside him now, echoing where silence used to live. He knew he had survived, but not escaped. The curse no longer belonged to Ebon Hill. It belonged to memory, his and whatever would come after. Behind him the rain continued to fall, unending, over a land that still breathed beneath it. Years passed before anyone dared to settle near the old Ebon Hill property. The soil there was said to turn tools dull and split wagon wheels. Rain slid off it without soaking in. No grass took root. No sound lingered longer than it should. The story survived as rumor. A plantation that collapsed into itself, a house swallowed by mud, and a man seen walking into the woods, barefoot and silent, never to return. People called it a curse, though no one could say whose. Farmers who passed the area spoke of the circular clearing that remained where the main house once stood. A perfect ring of dead earth that never changed, even when the rest of the valley greened again. On summer days, the circle shimmered faintly, as if heat rose from beneath. On cold nights it steamed. Children were warned not to cross it. Some did. They came back pale and shaking, saying they'd heard the sound of hammering far below the ground. Others claimed to have seen faces in the dirt, faint and slow-moving, like shapes forming under thin ice. No one went near after sunset. Decades later, a road was built, cutting through the old property. Workers cleared brush and leveled stones, careful to avoid the center. That was when they found him, a boy of about 10, living alone in a cabin near the tree line. He spoke little, ate what he caught and stayed away from strangers. The men who saw him said he looked like a ghost from the stories, broad-shouldered already, with the same dark skin and steady eyes the old tales gave the man called Solomon. But there was something else, something harder to explain. His gaze was clear but distant, as if his thoughts were too old for his body, and his eyes, pale grey, sharp, unyielding, were not Solomon's at all. They belonged to another man entirely. Some said the boy was a descendant, proof that Solomon had lived. Others said he was a remnant of the land itself, born from the graves that sank and rose again. When asked where he came from, the boy only said he'd always been there. In town, a few old men remembered fragments of the legend. The freed master, the 40 women, the nails. One even claimed to have seen a box dug up near the road when the rains flooded the site. Papers sealed in wax, written in Malachi Ward's hand. No one kept them. They were said to crumble on touch, like dust reclaiming itself. By the time another century had passed, Ibn Hill existed only as a footnote in local maps, unfit for cultivation. Travelers camped near it, but left quickly, saying the night was too long there. Nothing grew in the circle. The wind that crossed it made no sound. But each spring, a small footprint would appear in the center of the field, pressed into the soil, as if someone or something still returned to count. They say curses are born from hatred or sin. But the one that lives beneath Ibn Hill came from something quieter, a man's belief that freedom could be built from control, that creation could come from suffering, that strength itself was proof of righteousness. And though the land is silent now, the boy's eyes still watch from the tree line, waiting, because what began in blood never truly ends in dust. It endures, patient inherited, a memory with its own heartbeat. And the soil of Ibn Hill still remembers the man who mistook his chains for power.